Imagine tearing a tendon, or tweaking your shoulder, or waking up one morning, standing up from bed, and somehow injuring yourself despite doing absolutely nothing athletic whatsoever, which after age 25 becomes a surprisingly realistic possibility. Now imagine there was a combination of compounds that promise to accelerate recovery, reduce inflammation, improve tissue repair, and potentially help you get back to training faster. A stack so popular that it's been nicknamed the Wolverine Stack. No, seriously. And if you've spent more than 15 minutes in any bodybuilding forum, listen to one episode of Joe Rogan, or talk to that one guy at your gym who somehow has a source for everything, you've probably heard of it. BPC 157, TB 500. 2 peptides, 1 goal, recover faster. But here's what's fascinating. These compounds don't actually work the same way. In fact, if you think about recovery like rebuilding a city after a natural disaster, BPC 157 and TB 500 aren't two versions of the same thing. They're two completely different departments, and understanding that difference is exactly why people stack them together. So today, let's break down what BPC 157 is, what TB 500 is, and whether combining them actually creates the ultimate recovery stack. Before we dive into the Wolverine cinematic universe, we should probably answer one question. What exactly is a peptide? At its simplest, a peptide is just a short chain of amino acids. Think of peptides as biological text messages. Your body sends tiny molecular instructions constantly. Build muscle, release hormones, reduce inflammation, repair tissue, go to sleep, stop eating an entire family-sized bag of chips at midnight. Okay, unfortunately they don't all work equally well, but the point is peptides are essentially communication signals. And two of the most famous recovery peptides ever discussed in fitness circles are BPC 157 and TB 500. Let's start with the one that's probably become the most famous. BPC 157 stands for Body Protection Compound 157, which sounds less like a peptide and more like the name of a classified military experiment. BPC 157 is a synthetic peptide originally derived from compounds found in human gastric juice. And over the last few decades, researchers have become fascinated by its potential effects on tissue repair. Animal studies have suggested possible benefits in tendons, ligaments, muscles, bones, nerves, blood vessels, and even the gastrointestinal tract itself. Now, here's where BPC 157 gets really interesting. Unlike many compounds that simply reduce inflammation, BPC 157 appears to influence several processes involved in healing itself. Things like angiogenesis, or the formation of new blood vessels, tissue regeneration, cellular signaling pathways involved in repair. Think of BPC 157 like a specialized construction crew. You tear a tendon. BPC 157 shows up wearing a hard hat. It rolls out the blueprints, starts hiring workers, orders supplies, and immediately begins rebuilding. At least that's what animal research suggests. Because, and this is extremely important, human clinical data on BPC 157 remains very limited, which means that despite the absolutely insane testimonials you hear online, scientists still have far more questions than answers. But if BPC 157 is the specialized repair crew, then TB 500 is something else entirely. TB 500 is a synthetic peptide related to a naturally occurring protein called thymosin beta-4. And unlike BPC 157, which is often discussed as acting more locally, TB 500 is generally thought of as having broader systemic effects. Now, this is where people often get confused. TB 500 isn't necessarily famous because it directly builds tissue. It's famous because of what it helps cells do. Move. Seriously. One of the major functions associated with thymosin beta-4 involves regulating a protein called actin, which is critical for cell movement and tissue remodeling. Think about rebuilding a city after an earthquake. BPC 157 might be the construction workers. TB 500 is the transportation infrastructure. It's helping get materials, cells, and repair mechanisms to where they need to go. Animal studies have suggested potential roles in tissue repair, wound healing, inflammation regulation, blood vessel formation, cellular migration, which is why TB 500 became extremely popular among athletes dealing with chronic injuries, because if you're trying to recover from damage, improving the body's ability to coordinate repair everywhere sounds pretty appealing. And honestly, who wouldn't want a peptide whose entire marketing strategy basically boils down to, what if your body healed better? Unfortunately, once again, there's a catch. Human clinical evidence remains extremely limited, which means that while the theory is fascinating, the actual science is still catching up to the hype. Now we get to the interesting part, because once you understand what these peptides are individually, the logic behind combining them becomes pretty obvious. Imagine you're rebuilding a house. BPC 157 helps organize the workers. TB 500 helps coordinate the transportation, communication, and movement of resources. One focuses more on the repair process. The other focuses more on optimizing the environment where that repair occurs. Again, this is largely based on mechanistic theories, animal research, and anecdotal experience, not robust human trials, but from a theoretical perspective, they appear highly complementary. This is why bodybuilders, athletes, fighters, runners, and basically anyone whose body feels like it's filing a formal complaint against them often stack the two together. Because if you're trying to maximize recovery, the obvious question becomes, why choose one repair pathway when you can potentially target several? Which admittedly is also the same logic that got most bodybuilders into trouble in the first place. So, is BPC 157 plus TB 500 actually the greatest recovery stack ever created, honestly? We don't know. And that's probably the most important takeaway. The reason these compounds have become so popular isn't because we have overwhelming human evidence proving they work. It's because the theory behind them is incredibly compelling. One peptide potentially helps coordinate repair, the other potentially helps coordinate recovery itself. And together they create what might be one of the most interesting recovery strategies ever explored in performance enhancement. But perhaps the most fascinating part of all of this isn't whether BPC 157 and TB 500 actually work. It's realizing that the future of recovery might not be about training less, or resting more, or finding the perfect supplement. It might be about learning how to directly manipulate the biological systems responsible for healing in the first place. And honestly, that idea is either incredibly exciting or slightly terrifying. Probably both.